Welcome to the first episode of the LCM Dialogue Series. The Light Coordination Mechanism of the United Nations Department of Peace Operations has initiated this series to give member states a platform to share their experience in preparing and deploying uniformed personnel in UN peace operations. It's also intended to highlight innovative capacity building approaches and success stories. We hope the lessons learned and best practices we discuss here will benefit future peacekeeping deployments. Today we'll be hearing from two former commanders of Sweden's contingent in the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, otherwise known as MINUSMA. Brigadier General Per Nilsson, the Deputy Commander of the Swedish Army, and Lieutenant Colonel Carl Magnus Svensson, the Swedish Defense Staff, will be with us today to talk about their experience. But first, a little bit about Sweden's background in peacekeeping. Sweden has a long history in peacekeeping, starting in the earliest days. It deployed in the Middle East in the first UN Emergency Force, UNEF-1, in the Suez in 1956. It was among the first countries to deploy in the UN operation in the Congo in the 1960s and provided troops for missions in Western Sahara, Somalia, and the former Yugoslavia. Beginning in the mid-1960s, Sweden's deployments and peacekeeping missions declined. But Sweden has always remained a strong political and financial supporter of peacekeeping and actively supports training and lessons learned efforts. In 2014, Sweden sent its first peacekeepers to Mali, at the time of renewed European presence in UN peacekeeping in Africa. The Swedish deployment lasted almost a decade. It brought new capabilities and expertise to the mission, and also new challenges for Swedish peacekeepers. MINUSMA showed how complex UN peacekeeping missions and their operational environments have become. It also demonstrated how critically important it is for a mission's military and civilian personnel to have the skills, capabilities, and mindset to operate effectively together to deliver on mandates. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Let's talk a little bit first about how Sweden prepared its personnel and also the planning side. Of course, UN planning differs quite a lot from national planning exercises and from other international or multilateral organizations. How was the planning process like for Sweden as it re-entered peacekeeping after a long period when it didn't deploy troops?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this podcast. When it comes to Sweden and peacekeeping, I would say we have, as described, have had a very long history, and we have learned a lot during the years. But as also stated before, we went out of peacekeeping for some years, so we have to re-educate our officers and our soldiers in the ways of the UN. How does UN work, and how do we as a nation work together with UN to be as successful as possible?
Were there any particular aspects of the planning process, whether it was a question of logistics or a question of coordination, command and control, any issues that arose in the planning period?
I would say that it was more or less logistics was the main issue. You have to learn how UN work their logistics to be able to plan the mission in advance.
Right. And initially, I believe the Swedes were deployed quite remote, and you had the issue of building camps, etc. Were there any particular issues there that you had to address?
Maybe you can answer that, because you were the first commander in place.
Thank you, General. The logistical challenge was that the means of transportation and the infrastructure was very limited. That meant that we had to build our plan gradually, and for an example, access to water, transportation, and all those kind of things, and working together with the UN system closely. The other thing in the planning was also what can we contribute with. We are a small nation, so we couldn't contribute with a lot of quantitative factors, that rather that we could contribute with quality and small aspects of technological abilities. That's what we decided to contribute with. Also, there were other things that we had to plan for an example, the extreme climate, the heat that we, as living in the northern hemisphere, normally don't have to take care of that aspect. But we decided to train my contingent in the north, the most extreme winter climate, because extreme climate is extreme, whether it's hot or cold. You have to think ahead in every step of what you're planning to do.
In a country like Mali, which is landlocked and with very little infrastructure of any kind, particularly in the north of the country where you were deployed, what sort of things did you encounter that you had to do for self-sustainment, for example, and in order to be able to operate in that environment?
Sweden decided, given the low level of infrastructure, that we had to be self-sustainment for the first 2 months, as well as build our own camp. We even built an airstrip for the UAVs because it's more important to be on time, being there, starting to do something for the civil population, than be 3 months late with the perfect conditions, because the civil population doesn't really care about if we have the perfect conditions or not. The task is to protect the civil population and the mandate, and that was we were focusing on when we decided to build the camp and be self-sustainment for an initial period.
And I would say Sweden as a country is very good at, when we decide something, we really go all in. So I would say that is very, that is also what we are known for, I would say.
Right. So I mean, there is, of course, the logistical aspect, the technical aspect, but then it's training the people. So, I mean, that's a perfect segue on to this question of how do you prepare your people to go into an operation where, in fact, peacekeepers were being targeted and where the security situation was extremely tenuous. What sorts of measures did you do to prepare your folks to be able to operate in that kind of environment?
First of all, my rotation had trained together for 5 years, and there was specified mission training, I would say 8-9 weeks before we entered the mission area. And the training there was, I would say, focused on cultural awareness and also how to do warfighting with the different techniques that you have to use in this kind of warfare. We knew that the rotations before us had some experience, so some of their platoon leaders, company commanders, they were actually training us, and I think that's a very good model to do it. To have the people that have been in a mission before train you in the different ways of how to act inside the mission area.
Right.
There is a lot of training activities going on, and it all sums up in final exercise before going away. And for an example, it is scenario-based, and there are role players and also individuals with experience that maybe have lived even in West Africa that contributes to get as realistic final exercise as possible.
Right. So, in effect, you bring Mali to Sweden.
We bring a little piece of Mali into Sweden, yes.
Right.
As we bring a little piece of Sweden to Mali in return.
Right. The deployment of your people really depended heavily upon, obviously, UN logistics. It was interesting to hear you say that learning from others and then picking up from what their experience was important. And Colonel Svensson, you mentioned cultural awareness at the center of that. One of the things I think that really distinguishes peacekeeping as opposed to many other kinds of deployments is a focus on the women, peace, and security agenda, on the issue of gender. How, in your preparation of your troops, how did you prepare people to keep in mind the gender aspects of the deployment and the operations that you were going to be conducting?
I'd say I commanded an ISR unit. Main task was to gather intelligence for operational and strategic decisions within the unit. And one has to be reminded that since the people consist of 50% women, if we don't talk to that half of the population, we will get less quantitative and qualitative information. It is important to get a comprehensive picture of how a society is working, because in the mandate we are defending not only the mandate but also the population.
Right. Right. So, in what I'm hearing you say is that dealing with gender aspects on the ground and being conscious of how you're dealing with women in the society is actually an operational necessity. It's not a question of just ticking the box or making sure that you've covered a policy.
It really covers the whole aspect, from tactical issues, for example, what roads are women are using, for example, get to fresh water, to more strategic decision, to understand how women influences men that makes decisions on the ground as well. So it's the whole area of society that you need to understand that women has indirect or direct access to that kind of information.
And I would say as well, you have, when you plan an operation, you also have to consider how will this affect the population, and among the population there are women. So how will this operation affect women especially? I think that is important, women and children, because there are different patterns of life within the Malian community. So I think it's important to understand and try to take into consideration all these kind of aspects, especially in the planning of an operation.
Right. If I'm correct, I think there was a relatively high percentage of women peacekeepers in the Swedish contingent compared to what is normally the case. How did that figure in your operations on the ground, and what were the advantages of having that?
We have both men and women within our units. And as stated here before, I think it's very important that we can talk to both men and women out in the areas that we operate in. And I think it's a little bit more easy if a woman talks to a woman, in the purpose of getting good information. And if you can compare the information you get from men and women, I think there is a better understanding of the society.
Right. Sweden was deployed in Mali for almost a decade. What in your view were the biggest challenges that you had during that period? And if I understand correctly, during that period, not only did you shift geographically, you also shift the focus of your contingent's work. You talked about reconnaissance, you talked about intel and trying to develop better situational awareness.
In the beginning, and I was in rotation 5, I think we have a very good situational awareness what was going on in and around Timbuktu. And after a while, you can develop different working methods to even improve the information gathering more, because you're starting to know the people in the population. They know who you are and what you stand for, and that, I would say, is very important. And when you move to another area, you have to start all over again with that. So you lose the situation awareness in the beginning of when you are operating in a new area, but you're slowly building a better situation in new area as well. So it will the information that you get will improve your situation awareness over time.
I think one of the hardest things in the beginning for the first rotations was to find a balance between the need for tactical situational awareness locally in Timbuktu, the civil affairs that needed that one, but also the sector commander, but to balance that against the intelligence that mission leadership needed for more strategic and operational decision, because we were roughly about 300, so we could only do one or maybe two tasks at a time. But it was an important thing to find the right balance between intelligence for mission leadership, but also for the local leadership.
I would also say, add one thing to that. I think also when you're writing reports, that we did a lot, it's also important to know who will read these reports, so we can use the information to be preemptive in our actions. And I think in the beginning it was very difficult.
Right. Colonel Svensson, you mentioned civil affairs, and it has always struck me that there are different cultures within a mission. You have the culture of the host country, but you have cultures within the mission. Civilians have their culture for planning and their culture for operating, the military another. How did you work with the civilian components? You had Did you have community liaison assistants? Did you work closely with human rights and civil affairs?
It's a very accurate question because it goes to the core of how the UN family could and should work together tactically. I was lucky because we had a very wise female head of office that we worked through, and through her we got in contact with the Human Rights Division, other civil affairs divisions. But it all began with placing liaison officers there, and on a daily basis communicating, informing of what we do, what is our role, what can we contribute with. And over time, confidence between the civil affairs divisions and the unit grew to such a level that we actually could, on an equal basis, share information in support of the civil population.
Right. And were you able to do any joint planning? Did you take into account maybe what the civil affairs or political affairs or human rights people were concerned about as you did your planning?
After a couple of months, it was definitely so, because then the level of confidence between us had grown to such a substantial level that we could trust each other. Trust is important in field missions.
Right.
And I would say like this, I think it's important to separate the civilian work to the military work, but we were coordinating it. So when there was a civilian operation ongoing in a different kind of area in or around Timbuktu, we very often have coordinated this, so we were more or less in the same area to provide security.
Right.
And I would also stress that the head of office is a very important position, and if you can work together with that position, many doors will open up in the UN system. And I think this is you have to have this system working, otherwise you will not be effective.
Right. So that whole issue of being comfortable in exchanging information and being conscious of the cultural differences between the units obviously is important. While you were deployed in Mali, you were working with the militaries of many countries that you don't normally have interaction with, so there are cultural differences there too. What was it like to be working with other troop contributing countries, and were there things that you as Swedes picked up working with, for example, troops from other countries from the region, or even from further afield?
Yes, absolutely. The tool to work together was to develop a relationship, because without that relationship, it is hard to build a confidence that is needed in terms of crisis. One of our biggest challenges was that we are not a French-speaking nation by trade. So, but in the end, and it turned out to be imperative. For an example, when we defended Timbuktu, we did not do it ourselves. We did it together with other African nations that knew a lot about the opposing forces. They knew about the climate. They knew a lot of things that we could benefit from. And I would like to believe that we gave them a few pieces of advice as well.
Right. So it was an exchange and ultimately a partnership.
I'm truly grateful to have served with those African nations that were deployed in Timbuktu. They were vital for the cooperation and the result.
Right.
And I can especially mention the Burkina Faso battalion. We had a very good cooperation with them because they are more or less a regional player. So they could bring a lot of information to us. And it was also about trust. We have to build trust between the different units, because we opened up and showed them the capabilities that we used and had with us. It was both when it comes to intel gathering, but also when it comes to our medical facility. So I think this builds confidence within both battalions, and that meant that we could work together in a better way and in a safer way, both for the peacekeepers and for the civilian population.
Right. And aside from those countries that were from the neighborhood, so to speak, you also had countries like El Salvador, which I believe had a helicopter unit there. So this was another aspect of working with a military that was perhaps culturally and linguistically different. But what were the advantages there?
Since they had the helicopters, and the helicopters were mainly used from our point of view, for medical evacuation. So I think that cooperation meant that we could operate further away from Timbuktu in a safe way for our peacekeepers, because we knew that we can have a heli transport, a medevac, in the golden hour, and that I think is very important. And that also gives confidence to the troops, because they know if something happens to me, I will be taken care of. And that goes both for the Swedish troops and for the battalions that we work together with.
Right, especially in a theater like Mali. If I can shift a little bit here, MINUSMA was operating in a theater with other forces operating in parallel with very different mandates. You had not only Opération Selval at the outset, you then had the G5 Sahel force deployed. Do you have any reflections on what it's like operating in a theater where there are these parallel forces with very distinct and different mandates, but with which you have to relate and you have to communicate? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think for us it was also important to coordinate with the other operations that were ongoing in our area, because I think we saw the difference, but the population, they really didn't see the difference between the other operations and the MINUSMA operations. So I think we were there all together as one in the eyes of the population. But when it comes to coordination and cooperation, we have to be a little bit careful, so we don't mix up our, for example, rules of engagement. I think that is vital for us to have the correct rules of engagement. We had a clear mandate how and where to act, and they had their own mandate. So there's a difference.
And even on the lowest level, I think it's important to understand to what extent our mandate starts and ends, and where other forces in the area, for an example, Operation Serval, later Operation Barkhane, how they can interact each other and where they start and stop. Because I thought that all these forces that were present had its role, but as the general said, it's important to see that those mandates don't overlap or we have double capacities. But rather than complementing each other.
Right. And well, this really brings us to the question of public perceptions and communication with the population so that they do understand the differences. In Mali, you had a particular problem in terms of mis- and disinformation that was being used to undermine the mission. As a contingent, did Sweden have any special means of monitoring and trying to counter mis- and disinformation, and how did that fit in with the mission's efforts to try and deal with that?
I think it was coordinated within my rotation. We had a public information officer, and he coordinated both on the regional level as well as with the force HQ in Bamako. And I think in some cases we were more successful. But the most important thing for me was whenever a Swedish flag was seen on a uniform, my perception was that the population knew what we stands for, and I would also say that we were respected both by the Malian armed forces and also from the different armed groups out in the areas. And this is, as I would say, because we choose to talk to them directly. You couldn't be afraid. You had to go out and talk to them, and I think that the only thing they really wanted was to have a good dialogue. And when you had this dialogue, it was more easy to get your message out in a correct way.
Right.
No, I agree. I think every blue helmet has the capacity to carry a message that sometimes even goes up to all the way to the strategic level to convey a message and also explain to the population, given the fact that you talked about different forces and that we all been seen as the same function. Every blue helmet bears the capacity to convey such a message. But it became harder after a shift in the host nation government in the end of our Swedish deployment. It certainly transformed to a message rather defending our impartiality more than explaining what we were doing.
Right.
We use 3 words in my rotation: firm, fair, and friendly. So every soldier had this in his or her head when we were out on missions. You need to be firm. When you need to be firm, you always need to be friendly. And I think that's good. And of course, fair is also one of the basic values in Sweden. So it's very easy. You don't have to learn or give instructions to the soldiers. They have it in their blood from the beginning.
Right. And when you brought your people home, how did you handle the return to Sweden, and what was done to kind of capture the lessons that had been learned and build on them for subsequent deployments?
After each mission, we return back to Sweden in a very organized way. We have 2-3 days where we all meet and have discussions with professional, I would say, doctors who measure how we are doing. And I think that is of vital importance for me as an officer and for all the soldiers that have been abroad in different missions. When we take good care of our soldiers, I would say, when they arrive back home, of course, we can do more, but there is also a system that means that I am responsible as a commander for my soldiers for at least 5 years. And then they go out to the Swedish welfare system if more help is needed. So I think it's a very good system.
General, the issue of mental support for peacekeepers returning home, I think, is something that's often overlooked. But recognition and appreciation for the service that they've done is often a big part of mental support of the return home. Yeah. How does Sweden handle that?
When we return home, we have a parade for all the soldiers. Mostly, on those parades, our chief of defense, he or she is attending that parade, and in recognition of the work that has been done in the mission, everyone is given a medal for their job within the mission. So I think that is important, and that is also the first opportunity the contingent have to meet their family and friends. So I would say it's a high quality time for everyone who has been deployed to come back and be greeted by family and friends, and also to have some respect from the chief of defense handing out the medals at the parade.
Right. So in effect, it wasn't just the peacekeepers' contribution, it's the country's contribution.
I would say that there is a lot of people that are doing their missions back home, the families and relatives to the soldiers and officers that are inside the operation.
Right. I think that's a very good point, and that goes for all troop contributing countries, I'm sure. And what about institutional memory? I mean, you have a very strong international training and knowledge management system within Sweden. Was there anything special done to capture what you had experienced in Mali, particularly since MINUSMA was so different from many missions?
It was. The defense staff is organizing seminars, collecting all the lessons learned. One has to bear in mind that all the doctrines we have is a collection of all the wrongs we've done over the past 500 years. That has now been collected and summarized in advices how the best way is forward. And that has defense staff done in a couple of seminars, and that information is shared with the future contingent commanders and contingents. That is very valuable.
I would say many reports have been written and many books have been written about this in Sweden, and I think it's very worth reading this because we have a lot of good experience, and as you say, it's now in our doctrine.
For an example, also the Swedish National Research Agency in defense matters, I think they have produced about 3 or 4 reports based on interviews with former commanders that has been invaluable. Since we were the first Swedish contingent, we didn't really have anyone to ask. So we did a trip here to New York to interview people that had experience from Mali and MINUSMA. We also had bilateral dialogues with France and the Netherlands that has been here previously to pick up on any advice they could give us for a successful mission.
Right.
And in my case, we went to the third and fourth rotation for at least 1 week at each rotation to have information that they could give us, both in preparation for the training and also the latest developments within the country before we deployed.
Right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, just as Mali represents a lot of ground in a landlocked country, and I think your experience will be valuable to others. Peacekeeping is not an easy job, often a thankless job, but I think that Sweden's return to peacekeeping in MINUSMA was an excellent example of the kinds of contributions that all troop contributing countries can make when they come and pull together in a single mission. Thank you very much. I appreciated your comments today.
Thank you for having us.